Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Narva, a famous early battle of the Great Northern War fought on November the 30th, 1700 between the Swedish army commanded by Swedish King Charles XII and the Russian army of the Tsar Peter the Great, who was not present during the battle. We'll see it later why, commanded by Charles Eugène de Croix. I think this is the correct pronunciation because there is the emphasis over the ypsilon. The battle being famous mostly from a tactical point of view because it was an astonishing Swedish victory and a Russian disaster that somewhat exemplifies what the situation of the two militaries essentially was at the beginning of the war. So this war was basically fought by Russia in order to win back those fortresses in the Baltic that the Swedes had subtracted them during the period known as the Great Trouble, happening in the Muscovy back in the 16th century. And as you know, Peter the Great, taking name eventually from in fact the great accomplishments that fundamentally brought Russia out of literally the Middle Ages in a way, with the modernization, the westernization of the country, of the state at least, and of the army, right, which was at this point at a very early stage, right. So in order to understand the Russian disaster, we're talking about the Swedes literally breaking through a Russian defensive position of 3-4 times larger in number than the Swedish one, and therefore being caused by the low quality that still the newly recruited Russian regiments had, and especially the lack of an effective chain of command, either because of probably the lack of experience of the commanders during of the battle, right? The commander in chief as the ones of the various subdivisions, but also probably because these were, also the lesser officers were fundamentally just Russian noblemen without any practical experience that had been brought there after essentially the desertion of many of the officers that, because of the lack of pay, fundamentally had deserted the Russian army, had been, after the recruitment of these units, left essentially as garrison duties, and those were the emergential situations that in fact provisions that Peter enacted to strengthen the army in the first place. Also, the lack of experienced NCOs that were just drawn from the soldiery without even there much of an experience practically. The Swedish army, instead, being at this point one of the most powerful in Northern Europe, essentially a professional army, right, and would soon become essentially the strongest army in Europe, qualitatively speaking, under the command of Charles XII during the same Great Northern War. So much that the later defeat of the Swedes at Poltava by the Russians was essentially carried out by identifying the Swedish Schwerpunkt properly in the army itself that was worn out in this great march into Ukraine. As a matter of fact, while the Russians were retreating, making scorched earth policy and so on, a bit of this happened here too at Narva, at least, given the Russians were expecting the Swedes to relieve the siege of the fortress. The Swedish army, we'll talk about it. We've never made videos about that. I think we talked about the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus at some point, but not much in detail. But we will keep, of course, making videos about this. Hopefully, given that there is a connection, of course, between the army of Charles XII and one of his illustrious predecessor. So a Swedish military tradition that was quite, orderly, based on this great esprit de corps, also among the units that came all from the same villages. They cooked together, may seem something secondary, but it was very important to strengthen morale. They were heavily drilled. They were properly trained to perform habitually complex maneuvers, not just marches during parades and so on. This was something that Sweden had began to do historically since the mid, say, the first half of the 17th century, because of the increased resources availability. The steel exports during the 30 Years' War. Also, this time they were fueling the incipient industrial revolution in countries like England, that, by the way, together with the Dutch, were allied of Sweden in this war. So essentially Russia allied with Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, etc., against the Scandinavian country. And that was, all resources had been heavily invested in the army in this ever more professional sense. In fact, there is a debate even regarding the tactical aggressiveness, right, of the Swedish army, that the Battle of Narva would exemplify very well, both from a strategic and tactical point of view, that had brought to say, and the Swedes relied more on kind of different tactics from the others. As a matter of fact, this is not really true, right? European warfare at this point was growing homogeneous, and if you look at how the Swedes fought, it's not that they had any magic trick or knowledge about how to fight. It's just that they were a very well, as always, they were a motivated, very well drilled, and increasingly experienced army, which received a regular pay, had a continuity in service, and therefore looked ever more like properly modern armies were heading the direction of, as opposed to what most armies at the time were still, at least by an important degree, some made up of militia. And the Russians, in a sense, had been that up to that point. There were interesting differences. Swedish cavalry, for example, was a thing. Here, this was not much, any tactical specialty, or the horses were even small, actually. But, even them were well trained and practiced. But the aggressiveness of the Swedes actually was mostly dictated by the tactical contingencies, and the fact that they simply could perform certain maneuvers that would have been standard had the other armies had the same degree of professionalism, and that simply they were more quickly capable of enacting, right? So this is important in military history, because otherwise you lose even properly the sense and the importance of why these armies were kind of so better than the others. The Swedish army was, in fact, it would become during the war the strongest in Europe, the best qualitatively speaking, I mean. And again, this doesn't happen because there is somebody who's stupid and somebody who's intelligent, and there are just different things that others know and others don't for some magic reason. No, it's a dramatically intensive political, social, and military gestation that brings also unpredictably to different results, and in these odds of war, by the way, constantly, even to some reversals of the tides. The same war eventually was lost de facto by Sweden, so this is also eloquent. But it's important properly to assess the intrinsic quality that the Swedes, in fact, had cemented, had built up, right, to obtain eventually such extraordinary results like the ones of Narva. So today we'll just make a brief tactical history of the battle. We don't study the sources, because at this point actually I don't have it, because when we start to talk about modern times, there are lots of them, right? Also in many different languages, to make videos daily just covering them all, right? At some point I could do. That's the thing I always say. It took 1 year academically, at least I was doing something else in the meanwhile as well, but to write a 260 pages thesis about a campaign and battle in late 13th century Austria, right? So you can imagine by the beginning of the 18th century how much more there is, right? And I know how difficult it is also to just, it takes a lot of time to reconstruct everything properly, right? So much that You would think that there is a lot about the Great Northern War, even just historiographically or bibliographically, but as far as I understand, it's also not dramatically or overly documented reality in the first place. In fact, there is still much to write. As far as I know, for example, there is no in-depth study about Finland during the Great Northern War from a military point of view. It's something that I was somebody pointed out me as an interesting area of research that somebody could write a PhD on, for example. It would be quite interesting. But let's say the battle deserves still this and attention today, aside from the reason I'm making these videos now, where I show essentially Russian military history and defeats most, given the current times. And this video could be even interpreted as an homage to Sweden and the effort, the support they provided Ukraine with recently from a military point of view, the fears of Russia, the necessity of entering NATO and all these things. But like, for the sake of precision, of course, just note that everything that I have, as you know, something like a library of 12,000 military history books, right? And a lot of stuff, of the thing you can't even imagine. There isn't actually much about Swedish military history. And even about the Great Northern War, right? I have something that can't go even in important detail, but never really found those extras that would allow me also to reconstruct more thoroughly or in depth through the actual sources. I stressed are probably quite numerous. I count them in the severals of tens if you want to cover them all, right? And you must know Swedish and Russian and lots of other European languages. Even just think about the obstacle of that. So there is no easy knowledge of history. And what is interesting is that, in spite of the paucity, at least of the material that I use, it's still extremely useful, even for the amateur and the person that approaches military history for the first time, to see how discordant properly the accounts of these. I mean, of course, the accounts in the sources as well. You would imagine that studying history is just like, study a battle and everybody more or less say the same thing. Yes, I mean, if the sources are good, if the authors are reliable, after all, they at least all say it from a different perspective. They add something else, they stress different things, but they can't be reconnected. But there are also lots of things that do not really quite add up, right? Even the same Swedish sources sometimes about this battle say conflicting things. So even there, the partisan attitude goes out of the window, because simply these were big events that everybody had kind of their opinion on. But what strikes me, though, and this is actually more worrying, because the historical side is fascinating, but the historiographical one of contemporary eras shouldn't, at least, be, is that by today you would think that there would be kind of a standard account of what the Battle of Narva has been about. And it generally is, right? I don't think that publishing today really makes gross mistakes for which they redraw the whole map of the battle, whatever. It doesn't exist anymore, of course. But the narrative, I mean, the things you want to say and you want to put an emphasis on, those always change. So that you read an account and you say, let's call it a version, historiographic of this battle, and you say, the battle went like that. Then you read another one and you say, okay, this author stresses this other thing out. So you realize that all of these contemporary authors decided to describe it in a different way that makes you understand how complex actually the sources behind the battle are. And it's very easy to disorient, by the way, the audience sometimes when you make these considerations, because the average person would immediately think then, that there is some conspiracy behind it. There is no conspiracy. It's just that complex systems are, you need to approximate them in order to describe them effectively. Right, so a synthesis capacity is very important. I personally worked with battles for years, and my attitude, I even made videos about how to describe a battle. In that case, was a medieval one. It's just you should actually present the reader with all the sources, at least quoted in the notes in some ways, when you actually make an assessment about what happened on the field, and you explain why you pick one version, or you think at least that one event went in a way rather than another. I mean, just think about things like, I don't know, losses. Sometimes you really just have to, it's up to you to tell, because the sources often vary wildly on this. And this is always a premise that I make when I make this kind of tactical history videos, because people just want the chewed stuff, the pre-packed, the narrow, the down and ready, and the hard fact, right? The thing that troubles me was when I often Google stuff because they find the pictures for these videos, and I don't know, I search for this battle, like the Battle of Narva, the Great Northern War, and the automated result from Google, from other users have searches saying things, always search for the battle of this, the war of this, facts, as if, by the way, it was, it were difficult to find facts, like you just, buy a book and study the freaking story, right? You need to Google that and to even add facts, because you think that Google magically provides you with pages that tell you facts, right? What are facts according to you? There's this obsession that I'm radically and overwhelmingly worried about. Younger generations, in my opinion, are not understanding anything anymore, but even the slightest, about history. The deal that they know more about history is true, but knowing more doesn't mean that they know better things, or they have a more structured understanding of that. It's actually narrowing it down dramatically, because you have an overflow of information. Of course, people are going to know more generally, but in practice, they get ever more disoriented at the point that they feel this pathetic and paranoid need to stress, what are the facts, right? Go back to go study the sources, or get like an actual bibliography on the topic, right? Don't Google that. Also, don't listen to my videos if your goal is so scientifically driven, and unfortunately that's the point. It's not scientifically driven at all, right? So when I make this battle videos without the adequate background, I always say this to stress the fact that there is, of course, much more to know, and hopefully my dream is to cover the entire military history in detail. Of course, I will never leave enough for doing it even for a minimal part, like anybody, by the way, in a satisfactory way. But at least we can make some considerations about this battle. So a bit of strategic background just to understand also how important this battle was overall, because it was an enormous gamble. So the Russians had attacked Sweden in 1700. And it had happened properly with the Tsar Peter I commanding this large Russian army, as we will see, in number of 40,000. Many studies give it 37,000 to be precise, besieging the Swedish town and fortress of Narva. Here I'm not showing too many maps, not properly the historical ones, that do not make you understand too much, but it's not a big deal. The main point being Narva, it's in today eastern Estonia, with the border with Russia, and there is the Narva River that along which Narva stands. And Narva is on the west bank. The river flows north towards the Gulf of Finland, that is just a few kilometers distant. And so it's this fortification on the left bank that the Russians were besieging essentially from the same left bank, because they had blocked essentially the passage on the Narva, that from the other side of the river has Ivangorod, that is instead the Russian side, and it's just in front of Narva. This is the same, you could argue it's the same town practically. And I think, here I don't have information, but I think some Russian troops were present there. And the Russians were naturally besieging mostly the fortress from the left side of the river, having crossed it north at the Kamperholm bridge, from which essentially they would have to cross back if they, in case of retreat, and that had created this half crescent fortification, essentially encompassing all the bank with the Kamperholm bridge, Narva, enclosing it all together, given that from the west the Swedish army could send a relief force. And the Narva was important because it was between the two Swedish provinces of Estonia and Ingria. And the city, for a long time, had an important strategic role. It was originally probably a commercial town, and also it had this important fortress on the Narva River. And the town had been seized, as we were saying before, by the Swedes from the Russians in 1581, during the Russian and the Muscovite times of troubles, and it had formally become Swedish in 1595. So in September 1700, the 37,000 strong Russian army began the siege of Narva, and at the same time built such the aforementioned defensive field works in the opposite direction, to be able to shield themselves, to meet and repel any Swedish attempt to rescue the besieged. Narva was defended by a Swedish garrison under the command of Colonel Henning Rudolf Orn. And the situation was getting dramatic because there was no chance to resist for a prolonged time during the bad season, let's say, if Swedish relief had not arrived. So the Swedish army, commanded by Charles XII, landed in the Estonian harbor of Pärnu and started a march towards the northwest. What is interesting is that at that point is that a Saxon-Polish army of the King Augustus II had already landed in Swedish Livonia, but they had encamped anyway in the winter barracks already, so they were kind of out of the game. So Charles XII reached by early November Wesenberg, that is Rekver, that is this locality about 100 kilometers from Narva. He had only 10,000 men under his command, right? So dramatically few compared to the Russian army that was besieging Narva. Also, the logistical difficulties were increasing, and they were really big because winter, as you can imagine, November on the Gulf of Finland is already quite cold. Feeding men and horses, the Swedes had more than 4,000 cavalry, so that increases significantly the logistical strain together with the artillery, etc. It was becoming ever more difficult. Also considering that the Russians had preemptively carried out a scorched earth strategy all along the road that would have led the Swedes to Narva, right? So properly hoping to bog them down just because of the impossibility of foraging. But Narva was an important center. It was worth a gamble, which entailed at that point mostly time, because the fortress would have soon capitulated hadn't any reinforcement arrived, and the reinforcement had to be consistent enough, however, to break the Russian blockade of 40,000 men. So this meant that just a field army had to try to break through, right? And as we've seen, Charles had only 10,000 men. The serious problem there was that in order to reach Narva already, the logistical strains would have been great, because there weren't good stores around, right? The Swedish army was already suffering of supplies shortage at this point. So what to do, right? The best stores were in Western Estonia, that is from the other side. And as we've seen, the Russians had laid waste in all the land in between Wesenberg and Narva. And the closest supplies the Swedes could put their hands on were the ones of the same Russian army besieging Narva. And so the odds, as we've seen, were dramatically in favor of the Russians, had the Swedish army marched against. So there were just two alternatives: either leaving Narva on its own, and the Swedes didn't really want to lose it, or to attack the Russians. There could have been kind of a halfway that probably would have not helped. It was the worst one. It is for the Swedish army to remain in Wesenberg and waiting for further Swedish supplies, but in the meanwhile they would have been half starved in the same Wesenberg, and the broader strategic theater would have deteriorated. The Russians would have surely taken Narva at that point. So Charles XII, that surely stands out as one of the great commanders in late modern, at this point, history, extraordinarily gambled to march against the Russians, try to break the siege, the blockade, and to save the fortress, and hopefully, in fact, and necessarily, actually at that point, destroying the entire Russian army. And what I want to stress here is that there is no coming back, because if the Swedish army is defeated, like, it's defeated badly. It's not just defeated on the field, but it has to come back the way it came, with ever less supplies, with morale disrupted, with Russians probably on their tail, and so a dramatic, basically the annihilation of the Swedish army, and further possibilities of the war to go on. So the Swedes advanced with the only objective to get to Narva as quickly as possible, to find a way to destroy the Russian army in spite of the great numerical inferiority, and to accomplish their objective. On November the 13th, the Swedish army also met with a smaller Russian force under Boris Sheremetyev at Fiezhoki, if I pronounce it correctly. That was just a minor skirmish, actually, but it was important for boosting Swedish morale. And there is a tactical refinement that the Swedes carried out during this battle. It proved how well trained their army was. That is, they screened essentially their artillery deployment with their dragoons, and that when opening, say, their formation, allowed the Russian cavalry to be targeted by Swedish cannons at close range, and thus defeating it. Swedish cavalry, we were saying before, was kind of definitely more modern than the Russian one. The Swedes had fundamentally pioneered the same revival of cavalry warfare in the second half of the 17th century. They had been schooled by the important experience against the Polish cavalry that at the time was definitely the best in Europe. Also, Swedish cavalry commanders at this point in part had served in France, that had essentially the largest army, the most powerful army in Europe at that point, and so big games going on. Think about the Dutch War and so on. And the Russians instead were still having a very traditional way of mounted combat, let's say. From one side, they had an important amount of ethnic cavalry, so the one you could find in Eastern Europe and this kind of semi-nomadic traditions, etc. On the other side, they had a nobiliar cavalry that still followed the pattern of the old, of the old lanks, right? It was the heavy cavalrymen with the retainers, etc. It was an anachronistic type of arm. At that point, Peter the Great hadn't had the time to westernize it yet. It's not that it was dysfunctional, but still, it relied on a much more, cumbersome and kind of mechanic type of combat that the Swedes, that were much better trained collectively, of course, had it easier to easy to match. Swedish cavalry doctrine, if you could speak of something like that, was extremely brutal. Was, as we've seen, a big number of the Swedish army was actually mounted. We're talking about 4,000 men. So the Swedes relied on shock tactics that had to happen immediately, were properly aimed at closing in as quickly as possible and really to see the white in the enemy's eyes and pass to cold steel. And in many ways, warfare was still archaic at the time. I mean, you would think we're at the beginning of the 18th century. There were still actually pikes in the field. Still, the Swedish army had an important amount, with the idea of the pikes in the center, the musketeers on the wings, etc. Naturally, these wars would change a lot, and so that musketry would become, the universal infantry type. And as we will see at the same Narva, there was an important cooperation also with the grenadiers, etc. But the idea properly of even passing to the bayonet and to attack in hand-to-hand fighting, especially in such circumstances, in kind of a half-entrenched, fortified situation, were really there. We'll see what a bloodshed occurred in the Russian trenches that turned into a trap for their own defenders. So then on November the 19th, the Swedish army was at 14 kilometers from Narva. At this point, Charles didn't know whether the town had fallen already or not, importantly enough. So the Swedes fired some rockets with a special signal that the Swedes knew within Narva, and in fact that was responded to with their guns, showing that Narva's garrison was still resisting. The Russians were at this point aware, of course, that the Swedes were close, they were approaching, and however they didn't really realize that those 10,000 men were the entirety of the Swedish army. Also, for this reason, the Russians thought, well, not to attack the Swedes, because they thought this is just a part of their army, right? We don't want to risk to give battle in the open, because these are just 10,000 men. We can easily crush them with such numerical superiority as 3-1 fundamentally, because maybe during the battle the rest of the Swedish army will appear and will crush us while we are spent and so on. Instead, those were literally the only troops Charles had under his command. It was the entirety of the Swedish army. At that point, it was okay, like for the Russians in theory to also to just defend, because there were so many that they thought, well, even if they were aware, of course, the fact that the Swedes were superior in quality at the time, they would be reasonably confident in their own defensive position that had been carefully planned. Tsar Peter was in Narva up to the day before the battle and left the camp in a way that, considering also the ensuing Russian defeat, was considered abroad all over Europe, like, look at the Russian Tsar, he's a coward, he abandoned his army the day before the battle. We don't really know why this happened, but the main motivation, his intentions, were to essentially manage the arrival of reinforcements that he thought had to support the Russian army at that point, because still the Swedes were a threat after all, and the Russians thought more of them were to come. So St. Peter didn't expect that the day after the Swedes would have given battle, literally assaulting the Russian fortifications. Also, he wanted to negotiate further with King, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, Lithuania, Augustus II, because he also wanted to get some Russian aid and things like these. Peter was a modern, kind of Western-minded man, so he also cared about logistics. So he wanted to probably take care of all these things. And if one knows Russian military history at the time, you know that Peter was actually a brave commander. He risked many times his life in combat. So there is nothing like cowardice really from his side, and that generally shows, in a sense, how overconfident the Russians were, and properly unaware of the fact that not just the forces that were arriving were the entire Swedish army, but that the Swedish army was then to break, to assault, right, and break through their defenses. And the commander-in-chief of the Russian army became the Field Marshal, the Duke Charles Eugène de Croÿ. He was a Dutch officer of French origins, a very noble French family dating back to the Middle Ages of knights and so on. But this guy wasn't actually a Russian commander. He had never commanded any Russian unit. He had actually come there in the Russian camp to as an agent of Augustus II to negotiate with Peter, who had convinced him, basically also offering him a glass of red wine, etc., to become commander of the Russian army. And this guy wasn't like a particularly experienced commander, nor had, in fact, as we've seen, ties with the Russian troops. There was here, as we will see, and this would dramatically show up during the battle, that the Russian troops hated their foreign commanders, because there was this great, Peter had began to model Russia with all these Western influences. He had called necessarily also Western commanders, advisors, technicians, all these things. So they were seen as the ones that went against Russian, tradition, and so it was a dramatic reactionary resentment among especially the Russian nobility against these, against Peter in general and his westernizing policies. And so looking at Croÿ, that found himself at the head now, essentially 33,000 soldiers, right, around Narva, of whom 26,000 were properly placed to guard the front towards the Swedish rescue army. We realized that the Russians were confident. I mean, the Swedes were just 10,000, slightly more, like 10,200. You have 2,600 men, right? It's almost complete, 3-1 normally in war is like, you're okay, you can do lots of stuff. However, there were some faults in the Russian confidence in plan, because first of all, it's probable that they had understood at some point that the Swedes were maybe just what they saw. They were not sure, and realizing that, they also knew that the only way for them to do anything was to assault the Russians, because they had come there. If they were the only troops, that's the only sensible thing they would have tried to do, or at least if they were particularly timid, they would have not attempted it. So the Russians, as we'll see, toyed also with the idea of getting out of their entrenchments and to face the Swedes in open field, just in front of the fortifications, which some Russians, especially on the left, would actually do under Sheremetyev. Sheremetyev was a young Russian officer who had participated to the siege of Ottoman Azov, and had proven to be, capable commander. I mean, not a military genius, not given any proof enough. We don't know, but he would engage the Swedes with his cavalry, a Russian cavalry on the left. It's just he wouldn't be followed by the other generals, and the communications were terrible. But consider that the Russian fortifications stretched for 6 kilometers, and there were barracks in between. So also, famously enough, as we'll see better now, that the weather was terrible at the moment of the Swedish attack. So coordination, we've seen what the chain of command of the Russian army really was made of. It was terrible, and there was just no way to coordinate this broader assault on the Swedes at that point. Nor the Russians even realized the Swedes attacked up to when they did, and we will see why. And the Russian fortifications were imposing. There was essentially a 2.5 meter high embankment reinforced with 140 guns. The Swedes had only 37 guns. Also, there were lots of chevaux de frise as storm barriers, especially around the central fortification in the Russian camp. That was this little fort that kind of split in half the fortifications, that, by the way, were not continuous, however, because in between there were some barracks, and so it was difficult even just for the Russians to support each other along the line. And there weren't many reserves. At least I haven't heard of employment. Of course, there were Russian troops around Narva in the rear, and of course the Swedish garrison inside the fortress were few and not that significant, but still, attacking the Russians from the rear would have added in case of Swedish breakthrough to the collapse of the Russian morale. So it was always necessary to watch the besieged garrison. This happens in every of such situations. Now, Charles XII, as we've seen, had something just like 10,200 men. Time was running out. Supplies were running out. So there wasn't really much else that could be done. The longer they would have waited, the weaker it would have become. Also, the Russians would have understood increasingly better that that was the entirety of the Swedish army. So the Swedish general Carl Gustav Renskjöld made a plan that was both simple and easy, based on the concept of local superiority. It's a sort of Stoßtruppen idea, as we will see, because of course the Russian armies we've seen was stretched along all the perimeter. It was quite long, so locally it was vulnerable to a breakthrough. So what the Swedes planned, Renskild had these were relatively young but experienced officers. They had seen war both in the Swedish army and in foreign service. They were something that, unlike the Russian ones. So the Swedish army should be effectively concentrated on 2 points. There would happen to be essentially the sides of the central fortress along the Russian line, where the entrenchments were not there, would have had to break through and to effectively cut in 3 the Russian army. And it was a good plan, because if you manage to break through and to pour further troops in fact, the Swedish infantry would be deployed in column for this purpose. You could have swarmed right inside the Russian camp, and also taking out from the rear and in detail the various Russian regiments. In fact, would fall one after the other, especially in the center and on the right. But the left resisted. It was very dangerous for the Swedes, because the Russians didn't surrender immediately, and they could have launched a counterattack that could have wiped out, in fact, the Swedes at that point. We'll see it better. The situation was dramatic. Like, we often underestimate this in any war, but the privations and the lack of resources. The Swedes hadn't eaten bread in 4 days, and they hadn't eaten the last day before the battle. Just imagine to be there on Gulf of Finland in essentially at the end of November, in cold weather, in that situation. Also, to make the attack easier, in spite of the cold climate, the Swedish soldiers were issued to leave their clothes and knapsacks in the army camp. So desperate was the situation. The Swedish attack had either to be successful, or the entire game was lost. So who cares about cold or hunger? There you have to fight with the least impediment on a difficult ground. You have to consume the least amount of energies and just break through and make it. And before the attack, Swedish artillery located on some modest heights, but still to give them some ballistic advantage in front of the Russian lines, began to fire on enemy positions and enemy entrenchments. See, the Russians were fundamentally sandwiched between the entrenchments all across the line, and so the Swedish objective was to weaken sensibly these entrenchments in the areas that would have eventually stormed. And there was actually also a rocket signaling for the Narva's garrison that the attack had begun, so that they would know it. I don't know if the Russians had, I presume they had realized it themselves, but the fact that still that would have been the actual attack, where the Swedes would have sent all troops in. That's something that the Russians didn't know yet, as we will see, and that the Swedish garrison in the fortress had to be aware of, at least. So the Swedish army was deployed in 2 columns, 2 infantry columns in the central part. Like, they were divided actually on the sides, in the center, as we've seen, to attack the flanks of the central Russian fort, and with the purpose of breaking through just in the spaces between that and the other entrenchments. Swedish cavalry was covering the flanks. There was none in the middle, and it had the task to repel any Russian attempts to counterattack. this was very important because the Russians would have had to properly come out of their entrenchments to carry out a counterattack, and Swedish cavalry was the best arm to properly choke the Russian crossing and redeployment in the front. So it was a very good idea for that matter, and the only one, by the way, that could be profitably employed. And what really changed lots of things in favor of the Swedes was the weather as well, right? Because the situation was desperate, but there was a snow-blown hail that began from the west. The wind change began to snow literally in the face of the Russians. And this was not really great news for the Swedes as well, so much that some Swedish officers told Charles XII, look, let's wait before this snowstorm ends before attacking, because of course also the Swedish visibility would have been reduced, and it was important to coordinate this thing. But the plan was really simple. Everybody really knew what to do. So Charles XII probably realized the advantage actually that was given to the Swedes, because the Russians by that point didn't actually yet know that the Swedes would have assaulted their fortifications. And also, given that or at least of course they had understood they could do it, but they wouldn't know when exactly, so that they couldn't even see what was going on with that snow, and they couldn't aim with their guns that, as we've seen, were dramatically outnumbering the Swedish firepower. So this was a great advantage, and Charles XII issued, in particular, to begin Swedish musketry fire only at a distance of 20 meters from the Russian entrenchments, not before. Normally, at that point, a musket fusillade began at 70 paces, and this was particularly aimed at properly not making realize the Russians until the last moments, which was the Swedish position, so that they could have not fired on them because they didn't know they were there. The infantry columns were headed by the grenadiers, who brought with themselves their armament, but also fascines that were necessary to fill the embankments in order to make the Swedish infantry cross over it. And this was particularly important because the attack began. In fact, the Swedes fired their first volley. They killed a lot of Russians. The Russians fired back. They killed a lot of Swedes. And that was the most dangerous moment for the attackers. During this exchange of musketry fire, the grenadiers were frenetically working to fill the ditches, and it wouldn't be later than 15 minutes that Swedish infantry began to assault the Russian trenches. And this meant naturally passing to cold steel. And so attack with swords, bayonets. The chevaux de frise were thrown away with the use of the same swords. The Swedish infantry poured in because they were coming in different lines, right? So this was the point. The Russians were not knowing across all the line what was going on, right? Well, the Swedes were concentrating their forces and sending waves and waves of soldiers in the same point, so achieving local superiority over the Russian defense line segments that they were attacking. And thus, after a short while, really, the Russian front was divided into 3 parts by the 2 attacking columns. And both the Russian right and center basically broke, right? Began to flee towards the north, as we've seen, towards the only bridge, the Kampersholm's bridge, that was the only way of escape, given also that the Narva River was icy cold, and in fact, as we will see now, it would even collapse, and so many Russians literally, in order to save themselves, they threw themselves in the river and they died, drowning or properly freezing. And this situation was really disastrous because, again, the Russian left didn't know exactly what was going on, right? They knew, of course, the Swedes had attacked and broken through, but they didn't have enough communications with the rest of their forces, and there was, the Russians began to flee disorderly, so much that cavalry was first to evacuate in the north. Then the colors, the ensigns were brought, some arms, some weapons too. Then the bridge collapsed under the weight of infantry who was fleeing. However, in all this, there was 2 units that would have become eventually part of the Imperial Guard that made a barricade next to the bridge. They managed to reform in part properly even some of those who were fleeing, and to put up a stiff resistance. It was as stubborn as desperate, but still effective in a way to preserve, in fact, the crossing, at least what had remained of it, for more Russians, for allowing more Russians to flee. And it was a tough moment for the same Swedes, because in the meanwhile, the Russian cavalry it was concentrated on the left wing, had counterattacked the Swedes, right, and even successfully. So Russian cavalry eventually was not supported by anybody, because actually the infantry remained there. Their commander Videv was shot, was wounded seriously at the very beginning of the engagement. So Sheremetev and his horsemen remained basically out there without any support, and so they couldn't really do much in the meanwhile. And the problem was that the Swedes had already properly gotten to the Russian perimeter en masse, and their infantry was butchering them, and the majority of the Russians were fleeing. So the situation was really dramatic. And at the end of the afternoon, so only 3 hours after the beginning of the battle, the battle began at 2 p.m., right? Basically, what remained of the Russian center and the right wing were torn to pieces, and in full chaos, by the way. So this was a dramatic situation for the Swedes as well, because yes, they had broken through, but the Russian left wing was still intact. And the Swedish army was entirely spent, because the attack, of course, had been carried out with all forces available. So there was still cavalry around. By the way, in the meanwhile, the St. Charles XII had gotten into the fight. He, if I'm not wrong, he attacked not the central fort himself, but the barricades next to Kampersholm Bridge. That's where one horse was shot under him, so he risked his life consistently to break the Russian resistance there. It kind of made more sense also because the center, in fact, I think had been broken. Anyway, if somebody had entrenched in the fort in the center of the Russian line, I don't think that would have been this enormous threat, especially considering the fact it was surrounded by both the infantry, the Swedish infantry columns, and that the major problem was really the Russian left. It was still intact, and the Swedes were exhausted, they were hungry. So what they did is that they broke their lines in a way. They began to plunder the Russian provisions all around. And they wouldn't just take food. Lots of Swedish soldiers got drunk, so much that when night fell, had already fallen by that point, practically considering the latitude and the date, they began also to shoot each other by mistake, right under the effects of alcohol. This resulted into relevant casualties due to friendly fire, by the way. So this was a chaotic situation, because imagine you have just entered the Russian camp, night has fallen, you know there are still Russians out there, you don't know what really is going on with the snow and all, so it's terrifying. And the Russians could have really turned the tides at that point had their left managed to just to attack in the first place. But this did not happen, and the reason why it didn't happen, considering that Curry was on the left, where he's together with his staff. But what had happened during the Russian route is that the Russian soldiers had began to kill their own foreign officers, which they hated, and so probably the same Russian left was paralyzed, because the entire Russian staff there was being threatened by the same soldiers, and this is possibly the reason why at 2 a.m. the same surrendered, because probably they feared to be killed by their own same troop, right? So at this point, Swedish victory was total, right? So they had literally wiped out an army, at least 3 times their size. It was an enormous victory. The entire Russian army was fundamentally annihilated. Narva was safe, as the Russian siege was broken. Russian casualties were high, very high. They're somewhat, however, difficult to estimate. Some say that from 6,000 to 18,000 men died, either killed by the Swedes or drowned in the Narva River. We know that at least 4,000 Russian cavalry managed to escape over the river before the bridge collapsed. Also Sheremetyev cavalry, if I'm not wrong, managed at some point going south to find a bridge and pass it at some point. There are some sources on the size of Russian regiments made in January, after 2 months, that register a loss of 1/4 of the personnel. We don't know how many, maybe were already deserters during those 2 months, aside from the battle, but this would fit with an idea of from 8 to 10,000 losses properly. There were some regiments who suffered it kind of worse than the others, especially the 2 regiments of the guards that had put up the barricade next to the bridge, defending the retreat, which is something that you find actually in any battle. If you look at that, there's always somebody who stands their ground to allow others to save themselves, and taking very heavy losses. A big deal of Russian losses were counted among artillery, right? The Swedes captured near Narva something like 173 pieces. That is almost the entirety of the Russian artillery, including 64 siege cannons, and a bit later additional 22 mortars in a baggage train near Yam, that is located on the eastern bank of the Luga River, in Kingisepp. Also more than 4,000 muskets. So much that after this battle, the Russian regimental guns basically had gone. Right, the Russian army was without artillery that point. In fact, had the Swedes pushed into Russia, there would have been other troops they would have faced, probably would have taken them out quite easily, because literally they had gained an enormous firepower. However, was also regarding the Russian losses, we have to account the fact that many prisoners were freed by the Swedes because they didn't have properly the means to control them. Were so many. We're talking about arrests of another 10,000, 20,000 Russian soldiers that in part became actually prisoners of war, but some were possibly really liberated. Swedish losses were 900 killed and 1,200 wounded, so not really a few, right? But the victory was complete from a strategic point of view, from a tactical point of view. Was an extraordinary result, right? After this, the Swedish army would head not into the Russian heartland, but in the winter camp at lies in eastern Estonia. So this battle is like kind of part of the Swedish national epos, because there were so many tales later saying the Russians were 100,000 men, etc. The 1 against 10 fight, which is traded by a famous poet in 1818. So this was the day of victory, absolute victory. Indeed, the one at Narva in November 1700 is one of the Swedish army greatest victories ever, right, in the country's history. And it shows, even in here, the qualitative superiority of the Swedish army over the Russian one, not because of any particular, trick or genius. It's what von Clausewitz says all the time. In order to make it, the best thing is to be very strong. And the Swedes were very strong because they were very well motivated. They were very well trained. They had experienced commanders. They were determined, because being defeated at Narva meant to be annihilated. So they really didn't have much choice, did they? And they managed to exploit the enemy's weaknesses, mainly the fact that yes, the Russians were many and they were in defense, but they were so entrenched that they essentially lost their advantage in mobility, that some Russian officers had recognized that we have to come out of here and attack the Swedes in open field, because we have a major, that at that point our numbers confer us a great advantage as long as we can maneuver them. We can maneuver, and we have this broader, we can't concentrate our numerical superiority, and so on. And instead, essentially, the Russians remain trapped within their own entrenchments. The Swedes simply run over them by concentrating superior forces there. They were helped dramatically, as we've seen, by the concealment offered by the sudden snowstorm. That surely was a problem for their own visibility, but still, at a point that would have not really altered the broader mechanism, given that they were marching in column towards a fixed objective that they knew was, not particular, that the same enemy didn't know, right? They were targeting, and so simply the lack of visibility made the Russians unaware of what was going on until the Swedes properly entered their own trenches, began to storm it and to pour troops and to break through and to spread within the Russian camps and the barracks and taking supplies, etc. And so the lack of experience and quality of the Russian officers and COs, the fact that the Russian troops were just conscripted en masse, right, and put together in these new regiments, made them crumble one after one. And again, there is this interesting aspect of the Russian left managing to counterattack and even scoring some success against the Swedes. And the the initial losses also the Swedes took during the first assault, when Russians were still defended by the entrenchments and could fire against the Swedish infantry, respond to their fire. But it took a few before the grenadiers made their way through the entrenchments, allowing the rest of the infantry to follow them. You can imagine the brutality of this whole thing, and so yes, the morale of the Russian army largely collapsed, and the broader problems, the conflictuality between the Russian soldiery and the foreign officers and all these things would bring also properly to the paralysis of the Russian command. And Krui was captured, by the way, and there were losses. The Russians lost 10 generals and 10 colonels in the battle, etc. And I'm sure there is some other detail that I'm missing, but this is one of the most famous battles of the 18th century, kind of a good beginning for the 18th century, like in terms of epic confrontations. And the war would go on with lots of other battles between the Russians and the Swedes, and it's a dramatic historical reality. But for today we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me, and see you next time. Bye.